The Obsidian Tribunal Chamber, the heart of the Cynosure hegemony, was a vast, silent amphitheater carved from a single crystalline asteroid that absorbed all ambient light, leaving the space illuminated only by the holographic projections of distant stars and the cold, flickering data streams that pulsed above the central dais. The air, heavy and perfectly conditioned for the dozens of different species represented, held the chemical signature of fear, a faint, metallic tang that even the atmospheric scrubbers could not fully eradicate. High above, suspended in the black void of the ceiling, the primary arbiter, a creature of the ancient, slow-moving krill species named Xylos, rotated slightly on its axial tether, its multiple optical clusters focused with an unnerving intensity upon the single, pale-green geometric projection that hung, pulsing at the chamber's center, the designated territory of the newly emergent species, humanity. The tension was a palpable, crushing force, the kind that precedes the inevitable collapse of a tectonic plate, not a sudden tremor but a slow, grinding inevitability that threatened the stability of the entire 300-cycle piece. Counselor Vrez, a towering, chitinous being from the militaristic Thaxian spires, scraped one of its 6 barbed appendages across the polished obsidian floor, the sound a deliberate, high-pitched violation of the chamber's somber quiet. Arbiter Xylos, Vrez's voice, electronically translated into the hegemony's common dialect, was a resonant, grating bass that seemed to vibrate the very bone structure of the listeners. The data remains inconclusive, yet the pattern of emergence is textbook. Rapid technological ascent, aggressive resource consolidation within their local system, and now, the deployment of a long-range exploratory vanguard. They move with the tactical certainty of a species that expects conflict. We cannot allow this period of inconclusiveness to become the prelude to our systemic unraveling. They expect us to negotiate, perhaps, or to posture. But what if they simply expect to take? A soft, almost liquid chittering sound, the native voice of Counselor Alara, the representative of the contemplative and non-aligned Phelan, cut through the Thaxian's aggressive resonance. Alara's form was barely visible within its light-refracting environmental field, a shimmering column of internalized light. Expectation, Counselor Vrez, is the foundation of all tactical error. Your analysis is predicated on the assumption that humanity adheres to the known historical archetypes of nascent starfaring polities. They have not aggressed. They have not violated the buffer zone boundary, not in any quantifiable physical sense. Their exploratory vanguard, as you term it, maintains an orbital drift pattern that is, statistically speaking, entirely defensible, yet positioned with a curious, almost polite deference to the established Cynosure border markers. We have sent 3 separate high-level diplomatic packets, incorporating the most exhaustive analysis of their cultural transmissions, their historical records, their entertainment media. The analysis is contradictory. They display a fierce, almost savage capacity for internal conflict, yet their philosophical and ethical texts speak of universal rights, empathy, and a concept of non-zero-sum engagement that transcends standard resource-based diplomacy. They expected troops, yes, perhaps, but what if their own preparation is simply a mirror of their internal cultural dichotomy? What if the expected threat is their own prior nature, and their approach is a deliberate attempt to transcend it? The primary arbiter, Xylos, finally stirred, its massive, segmented body settling into a new orientation. The rotation was slow, deliberate, a movement that spoke of deep time and inherited wisdom. The synthesized voice that emanated from its translator array was a low, dry rustle, like sand shifting in a vacuum. The Phelan raises the core epistemological concern. We possess a multitude of sensor readings, deep space astronomical observations, and intercepted communication bursts. Yet all our accumulated knowledge of interspecies engagement fails to provide a cohesive model for the human strategy. Vrez sees a classic military probe. The Cathar observers predict a slow, economic infiltration. The Zidonian psychoanalysts argue for a sophisticated, deep-cover psychological warfare campaign predicated on the projection of overwhelming, yet carefully restrained, logistical capacity. We have detected the massive energy signatures of their primary vessels, structures of a scale that dwarf even the Thaxians' grand annihilators. Yet these signatures remain static, their weapon ports shielded, their propulsion systems operating at minimum energy-saving output. They have established a perimeter defense that is demonstrably impenetrable by current Cynosure standards, a network of kinetic deterra. NCE fields and gravity manipulation nodes that defies our conventional understanding of sublight velocity defense. But this defense is purely passive. It projects no threat, it simply exists. The Krill arbiter's words hung in the silence, each syllable a weighty anchor dropped into the political abyss. The hegemony was built on the principle of predictable, quantifiable power dynamics. An emergent species was supposed to be either aggressively expansionist and thus easily contained by the collective might of the cynosure, or tentatively diplomatic, easily absorbed into the hegemony's economic and political sphere. Humanity was neither. Their initial presence was a paradox, titanic strength deployed with the quietude of a moon orbiting a forgotten planet. They were a question mark drawn in the vacuum of space with the gravity of a black hole. They were an enigma wrapped in an ethical quandary, secured by a technological defense that was, by all metrics, overwhelming. A smaller whirring form detached from the shadow of the arbiter's dais, the diplomatic emissary, a nimble eight-legged Cygnian named Kell, its body a complex weave of biological tissue and hardened polymer. Kell's voice was sharp, high-pitched, and filled with a controlled urgency. Arbiter counselors, the analysis of their deepest penetration communication packet, the one designated Project Genesis anchor, has yielded a partial, yet profoundly disturbing, breakthrough. It is not a military plan. It is not a diplomatic overture. It appears to be a logistical manifest, a detailed, itemized inventory of the contents of their largest vessels, the ones we have designated star hulls. The sheer volume of material is astronomical, not armaments, not strategic resources, but seeds, genetic archives, water purification systems of an unimaginable scale, prefabricated atmospheric reprocessing units, entire, self-contained cultural preservation databanks. The manifest includes detailed schematics for biodomes capable of supporting dozens of planetary biospheres simultaneously. It details enough industrial fabrication machinery to reconstruct an entire solar system's infrastructure from base elements. They did not deploy an expeditionary force. They deployed a portable civilization. A wave of low, guttural murmur swept through the tribunal. The Thaxians exchanged worried clicks of their mandibles. The Cathar, whose society was based on centuries of carefully managed scarcity, began to visibly shudder in disbelief. The human vessels, the silent behemoths drifting just beyond the border, were not mere ships. They were arks, but arks built not for escape from a dying world, but for the deliberate propagation of life and industry on an interstellar scale. This was not the expected act of a military force seeking territory. It was the act of a species seeking to replicate its entire existence across the void. An act of sheer, unbridled logistical hubris. They expected troops, Counselor Vrez repeated, the aggressive edge momentarily gone from his voice, replaced by a raw, calculating fear. But they brought an empire in a box, an empire not of territorial conquest, but of self-sufficient creation. This is a far more fundamental threat to the hegemony's established order. We manage scarcity, they introduce abundance. We manage fixed political borders, they introduce transient cultural spheres. How do you negotiate with a concept? How do you wage war against the intent to simply build? Ilara the Phelan seemed to brighten within its field, the internalized light shifting to a calmer, contemplative blue. Perhaps, Counselor, the greatest threat is also the greatest opportunity. Their deployment speaks not of immediate conflict, but of deep-seated long-term planning. The scale is overwhelming, yes, but the intent is benign, or at least self-focused. Their logistics are a projection of their internal philosophy. They must bring everything with them because they value their own cultural continuity above all else, even above the ease of simply acquiring resources from others. They are carrying a heavy, self-imposed ethical burden, the burden of not taking. They are not conquerors, they are simply carriers. The debate raged for 3 full rotational cycles of the crystalline asteroid, a microcosm of the hegemony's internal political struggle. The Thaxians arguing for a preemptive, high-risk military demonstration to force a traditional diplomatic surrender. The Cathar advocating a slow, patient economic strangulation. And the Phelan pleading for a deeper, more philosophical engagement, a true attempt to understand the mind of humanity. The sheer word count of the debate, the thousands of hours of translated and cross-referenced data, the sheer expenditure of political capital, all centered on a species that had, thus far, committed no act of aggression, only the offense of being incomprehensibly prepared. The resolution, finally passed by a narrow fee. Our driven majority was a hybrid of caution and desperation. A single, final diplomatic probe, the Cynossure's highest level, most revered emissary, would be dispatched to the human starhulls. The protocol was simple: project an image of measured, ancient power and demand clarity. Demand the reason for the deployment of such staggering, unprovoked logistical power near a sovereign border. The primary arbiter, Xylos, announced the decision with a low, mournful resonance. The vessel's silent consensus is en route. It carries the full weight of the Cynossure's accumulated wisdom, our history, and our fear. May the architects guide its passage, for we have reached the limit of our capacity for prediction. The holographic projection of the human territory faded from the chamber, replaced by the silent, indifferent stars. Acti had concluded not with a bang, but with a paralyzing political stalemate born of sheer, overwhelming logistical mystery. The emissary vessel's silent consensus was not a ship of war, but a mobile temple, its hull sheathed in millennia-old ceramic plating that shimmered with the residual energy of countless diplomatic exchanges. Within its primary observation deck, Admiral Tarsk, the Cynossure's appointed negotiator, a creature of pure, rigorous logic from the technocratic triumvirate, watched the slow, meticulous approach to the human perimeter. The human defense network was a web of silent, almost invisible nodes, humming with contained gravitational power. Tarsk's internal chronometer registered the passage of the designated 3-hour holding pattern, and then a single, clear, mathematically perfect wave of energy lanced out from one of the massive star hulls. It was not a weapon discharge. It was a communication handshake, a burst of data that resolved itself into a perfect universal language key, a linguistic primer capable of translating all Cynosure dialects into the human's primary language, English, and vice versa, complete with full contextual and cultural nuance. The sheer computational elegance of the primer spoke of a technology far surpassing the Cynossure's most advanced AIs, accomplished in a burst of data that lasted less than a single millisecond. Then a voice. It was synthesized, but with a curious, low cadence that spoke of calm, measured patience. The translation was instantaneous, flawless, projecting into the silent consensus's interior environment with the quiet authority of an internal command. This is the Human Expansion Fleet Primary Vessel Genesis Anchor 1. We acknowledge your vessel, silent consensus, and your diplomatic intent. We have maintained strict adherence to the Cynosure buffer zone protocols and have taken no aggressive action. We apologize if the sheer scale of our logistical deployment has caused political apprehension. That was not our intent. We detected your approach. Your request for clarity is understood. We transmit now the human diplomatic credential and the full open-source schematic of Genesis Anchor 1. We offer immediate, fully transparent entry to our primary diplomatic receiving sphere. We request your acceptance of our sincere desire for a non-confrontational engagement. We expected troops. We brought the seeds of our civilization. We are prepared to explain why the latter is, for us, a far greater investment. Admiral Tarsk, who had prepared for hours of ritualistic, measured silence and the slow, adversarial exchange of heavily coded data, felt a sudden, profound disorientation. The human communication was neither aggressive nor supplicating. It was simply efficient. It cut through all the expected layers of diplomatic posturing with the calm, surgical precision of pure, unadulterated logic. The transmitted schematic of Genesis Anchor 1 was the true shock. Tarsk's sensory array processed the data. The vessel was over 300 kilometers in length, a colossal modular structure. Yet the interior was not filled with weapon systems or barracks, but with hydroponic farms, genetic sequencing laboratories, vast, multi-layered data archives, and what the schematic labeled human cultural preservation habitat spheres. Miniature, self-contained biospheres designed to replicate Earth-standard gravity, atmosphere, and ecological diversity. The entirety of the vessel's energy output was dedicated to life support and internal manufacturing. The weapon systems were minimal, purely defensive, tucked away behind kilometers of secondary and tertiary shielding. They had brought enough potential energy to glass a planet, but they were using it to grow lettuce. The sheer, overwhelming nature of the logistical manifest that the Cygnian emissary had reported to the tribunal was now confirmed, magnified 1,000-fold. The human fleet was not a military formation. It was a mobile, self-sufficient, cultural and biological singularity. This was the unleashing of humanity, the total, uncompromising commitment of their Resour. CES not to defense or offense against an external foe, but to the preservation and expansion of their own highly complex, fragile ecosystem and culture. It was an act of extreme, self-focused biological and cultural tenacity. Tarsk ordered the silent consensus to accept the entry vector. The vessel slid into the diplomatic receiving sphere, a vast, open space within the star hull shielded from the vacuum. The first visible human that Tarsk encountered was not a general, nor a politician, but a woman in simple, utilitarian gray clothing. Her demeanor was calm, her posture relaxed, yet her eyes held an unnerving depth of focused, rational intent. She extended a hand, a common human cultural greeting Tarsk's database immediately flagged. "Welcome, Admiral Tarsk. I am Ambassador Lyra Chen, the Chief Logistical Coordinator and Diplomatic Plenipotentiary for the Expansion Fleet. Please do not stand on ceremony. We have a great deal to discuss, and a limited amount of time before the hegemony's political apparatus collapses from the sheer stress of strategic uncertainty." Tarsk was momentarily stunned by the blunt, accurate summation of the cynosure's internal state. "Ambassador Chen," Tarsk's translated voice was a carefully modulated monotone. "Your directness is atypical. The cynosure hegemony demands clarity. Why this astronomical, unprovoked deployment of logistical capacity at our sovereign border? We expected troops. Your technology, your energy signatures, suggest you could project force across half the spiral arm. Why instead do you deploy what appears to be a planet's worth of agricultural output and academic research?" Ambassador Chen gestured toward a simple, circular table where refreshments, pure, filtered water, a biological necessity for both species, were silently presented by a small, autonomous logistical drone. "Admiral, let us speak with the pure, non-zero-sum efficiency your species values. The answer is simple: redundancy. Our own history is replete with self-inflicted systemic collapse, ecological destruction, total war, and localized extinction events. We learned the hard, ethical lesson that the greatest threat to humanity is not the external adversary, but the fragile, often irrational nature of our own internal politics and the inherent instability of a single-planet civilization. Our unleashing, as you term it, is the total commitment to a three-point strategy: absolute self-sufficiency, absolute ethical non-interference, and absolute redundancy of culture and biology." She paused, allowing the gravity of the statement to settle into Tarsk's logical processor. "We came here, to the edge of the galactic core's settled regions, precisely because of the cynosure hegemony's established peace and technological stability. We did not come to take anything. We came to build our secondary, tertiary, and quaternary homes, utilizing the vast, unclaimed stellar dust and gas clouds that are of no strategic value to your civilization. We brought the Genesis anchors, these colossal vessels, because we would not, under any circumstances, place ourselves in a position of resource dependency on an established power, nor would we risk the accidental political friction of resource acquisition from your territory. We cannot be held hostage by a trade embargo, a diplomatic slight, or a sudden localized conflict. We have guaranteed our survival, not by building the largest weapon, but by building the largest, most redundant garden." Tarsk processed the data. The logic was cold, pure, and utterly alien to the cynosure political mind, which was inherently based on managed dependency and controlled scarcity to maintain political power equilibrium. The humans had utterly transcended the need for negotiation based on resource exchange. They had rendered themselves diplomatically immune by being perfectly self-sufficient. This was the true, terrifying nature of their power. They had weaponized logistics. "The scale," Tarsk pressed, his voice betraying a hint of his species' professional shock. "The investment of resources, the energy cost, it is beyond calculation for such a distant, non-immediate threat. The sheer magnitude of this endeavor could have powered a galactic military campaign for 100 cycles." "Indeed," Chen replied, a faint, almost clinical smile touching her lips. "And that is the core philosophical difference. We chose a different type of war, the war against entropy, the war against oblivion, and the war against the self-destructive tendencies within our own species. We dedicated our entire collective global economy, our entire technological output, to this single generational endeavor. It is a long-term strategic defense that transcends any tactical engagement with an external power. You expected a conventional adversary with finite resources. You received an entire civilization dedicating infinite capacity to its own ethical preservation. We have already won the war we set out to fight. The war for our own future. We are now simply here to begin the next phase, the unleashing of our full scientific, cultural, and ethical capacity into the wider galactic environment without precondition or demand. Over the next cycle of rotation, the exchanges between Ambassador Chen and Admiral Tarsk became a series of deep, immersive dialogues, transmitted in real time back to the anxious Cynosure tribunal. Chen presented not arguments, but vast, open-source data packets. She revealed human breakthroughs in energy generation, utilizing exotic matter conversion with near-perfect efficiency that would instantly revolutionize the entire hegemony's power grid. She detailed their advanced terraforming protocols, capable of resurrecting dead worlds within a manageable timescale. She showed them their entire uncensored history, the devastating wars, the cultural triumphs, the philosophical self-critiques, all laid bare. The goal was not to impress, but to provide a verifiable, fully transparent dataset upon which a true diplomatic relationship could be built, free of the ambiguities and political hedging that plagued the Cynosure's own internal politics. The effect on the Obsidian Tribunal was cataclysmic. Councillor Vrez, the Thaxian, initially ranted about the transparency being a deliberate psychological maneuver, a data overload designed to conceal a single fatal weakness. But the data resisted all attempts at falsification. It was too vast, too internally consistent, and too ethically uncomfortable for the cynical Cynosure mindset. The humans had willingly broadcast the blueprint of their own ultimate weapon, the capacity to solve problems of existence not through conflict, but through engineering, logistics, and an uncompromising commitment to long-term survival. The political fear began to morph into a strange, awestruck philosophical dread. The large-scale reveal came during the third rotation. Ambassador Chen, responding to Tarsk's query about the strange, high-energy particle emissions occasionally radiating from the deepest recesses of the star hulls, transmitted a single, massive data file simply labeled Project Chiron. Project Chiron was not military technology. It was a staggering, generation-spanning scientific endeavor, a deep space, high-energy particle emitter receiver array designed to detect and analyze ultra-low frequency gravitational anomalies at the very edge of the observable cosmos. It was an interstellar telescope of unimaginable power. The star hulls, it turned out, were not just arcs and factories. They were mobile, self-sustaining science platforms dedicated to exploring the fundamental nature of the universe. The human expansion fleet was a civilian, scientific endeavor masquerading, by its sheer size, as a military threat. They had not come expecting to fight the Cynosure. They had come expecting to look past the Cynosure. Admiral, Chen's voice was relayed to the entire tribunal via Tarsk's live link, her tone calm, professional, yet imbued with a subtle, profound gravity. The logistical deployment, the energy output, the scale that troubled you, it is all necessary for Chiron. We are not just carrying our history, we are carrying our curiosity. We have calculated that a fundamental instability exists within the large-scale structure of the galaxy. We have been collecting data on anomalous energy fluctuations for over 100 of your standard cycles. We deployed the fleet not just for self-preservation, but to position Chiron in the optimal deep space location, beyond the primary stellar noise of the core, to capture the full spectrum of this instability. We expected troops. We got a clear field of study. We are observing the universe. Now perhaps you should observe with us. The sheer, audacious humility of the statement, that their colossal logistical deployment was merely a footnote to a purely scientific endeavor, shattered the last remnants of the tribunal's capacity for predictable response. The political paralysis within the Obsidian Tribunal was finally broken, not by consensus, but by the sheer, undeniable weight of the human data and the cold, rational logic of Ambassador Chen's presentation. The Thaxians were silenced by the sheer impossibility of defeating a foe whose primary strategic goal was self-sufficiency and whose primary weapon was logistics. The Cathar were baffled by the human capacity to generate limitless abundance, thereby invalidating their entire socioeconomic structure based on managed scarcity. Only the Phelan, Councillor Alara, seemed to have anticipated the philosophical depth of the human intent. Arbiter Xylos called for a full, mandatory data integration period, a period of imposed silence and introspection that lasted for 5 full cycles. When the tribunal reconvened, the fear was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling reverence. Admiral Tarsk, having spent the entire period in continuous open-channel dialogue with Ambassador Chen, now stood before the tribunal, his logical processors humming with the weight of newly acquired truth. Councillors Arbiter, Tarsk's voice was steady. The human species is not an emergent threat. It is a systemic paradigm shift. Their unleashing is the total prioritization of the ethical imperative. the absolute preservation of their cultural and biological integrity without external imposition. Their power lies not in their destructive capacity, which is substantial, but in their choice to reserve that capacity entirely for the defense of their creation, not for the taking of others. They have provided the hegemony with an open-source solution to every major systemic bottleneck: energy, food scarcity, planetary degradation, cultural archiving. They demand nothing in return, only the right to their autonomous, self-sufficient existence and the non-interference in their scientific endeavor, Project Chiron. We expected troops. We were delivered a profound, unsettling mirror reflecting the limits of our own political and ethical imagination. The tribunal voted, this time with a near-unanimous majority, to formally recognize the human expansion fleet as an autonomous, non-aligned entity within the hegemony's sphere, granting them all necessary access to the previously restricted, resource-poor outer regions for their self-construction projects, conditional on continued, complete data sharing of their logistical and scientific findings. The Act of Alliance was formalized not with the signing of a treaty, but with the simple, pragmatic agreement to collaborate on the analysis of the data stream from Project Chiron. The ancient Cynosure hegemony had, in a single, politically catastrophic moment, moved from a strategy of cautious containment to a strategy of unprecedented, trust-based collaboration. The fear was replaced by a shared, dizzying sense of potential. Ambassador Chen arrived in the Obsidian Tribunal, not physically, but as a perfect, three-dimensional holographic projection, a small yet commanding presence amidst the colossal ancient architecture. Her communication was brief and focused not on diplomacy, but on the new shared task. Arbiter Xylos, counselors, the Cynosure's decision is accepted, and its logical efficiency appreciated. The human expansion fleet is now fully integrated into the regional surveillance network. We shift now from the internal political discussion of human intent to the external reality that necessitated our logistical investment. Project Chiron has produced a verifiable anomaly. The projection of Ambassador Chen was replaced by a massive, multi-spectrum data visualization, a map of the galactic structure shimmering with the known stellar pathways. And then, a single, impossibly vast geometric structure resolved itself at the very edge of the observable datasphere, positioned far beyond the influence of the galactic core, a distance that defied all conventional travel models. It was not a stellar body. It was not a nebula. It was a structure. It spanned entire sectors of space, a colossal, dark lattice of unimaginably dense material that seemed to absorb the light and gravitational influence of entire star clusters. The Cynosure data archives were instantly cross-referenced. No known species, no recorded event, no theoretical prediction could account for the object. Its sheer mass defied the laws of physics as understood by the hegemony. We have termed this anomaly the Veil of Kronos. Chen's voice resonated through the chamber, calm and clinical against the backdrop of the cosmic impossibility. It is not a natural phenomenon. It is an artifact, a megastructure of an ancient, unknown provenance. It is static, yet the gravity well it generates is distorting the space-time fabric of the entire regional cluster. More critically, its internal structure is generating an ultra-low frequency signal, a structured, non-random wave that has been propagating across the void for hundreds of millions of your standard cycles. This is the instability we detected, the evidence of a civilization whose capacity utterly dwarfs even the combined logistical output of the Cynosure hegemony and the human fleet. The tribunal was silent, the previous political crisis now seeming like a quaint regional dispute. The universe had just expanded, geometrically, impossibly, and terrifyingly. Counselor Vrez, the Thaxian, spoke first, his voice stripped of its arrogance, replaced by a profound, humbled awe. A construction of that scale, it would require energy and resources beyond the theoretical limit. What? What species could possess such capacity? And more importantly, why would they build a structure that seems only to exist to wait? Ambassador Chen replied, her holographic projection pulsing faintly with the gravity of her words. That is the larger twist, Counselor Vrez, the signal. We have finally translated a portion of the structured wave. It is not a warning. It is not a declaration of ownership. It is not a message for a contemporary civilization. It is a single, continuous, mathematically elegant packet of information, repeated across 1 billion years of time, clearly aimed at any species capable of detecting and comprehending it. She paused, and the full weight of the human experience, the history of self-inflicted disaster, the philosophical depth, the overwhelming logistical commitment, coalesced into the final, stunning revelation. The message is not a question but an imperative. It is the architectural schematic for a device, an impossibly complex, self-replicating, interdimensional portal generator. And the schematic is encoded with a philosophical, ethical lock. It can only be activated by a species that has achieved absolute, non-predatory, self-sufficient harmony across a multi-generational time frame. It is a final cosmic test, a filter designed by a species that anticipated the inevitable, self-destructive nature of all emergent civilizations. They built the Veil of Chronos not as a defense, but as a message anchor, a silent, patient testament to their own transcendence. They expected troops. They waited for a species that would come to the stars not to take, but to build, not to fight, but to survive with such overwhelming, logistical commitment that conflict became logically redundant. They waited for the species that would prioritize the preservation of a single ethical concept over the acquisition of an entire galactic sector. They waited, Chen concluded, her holographic eyes seeming to pierce the tribunal's accumulated fear and uncertainty. They waited for humanity unleashed, not the fighting spirit, but the engineering spirit, the ethical spirit, the unstoppable drive to simply exist on its own terms. They waited for us to bring the garden, not the gun. And now the construction specifications for the largest leap in cosmic evolution ever conceived, a bridge to the unknown, built by a species that transcended its own internal conflict, is within our grasp. Our alliance, Cynosure, is not a political expediency. It is the prerequisite for the next stage of universal existence. The silence in the Obsidian Tribunal was absolute, broken only by the slow, rhythmic rotation of Arbiter Xylos on its axis. The Cynosure hegemony, founded on fear and maintained by political equilibrium, had just been confronted with a cosmic destiny forged by a greater, ancient civilization's hope, a destiny that required the precise, logistical commitment and the overwhelming, ethical self-control that humanity had demonstrated. The long, terrifying philosophical shadow of the human presence, the sheer scale of their self-sufficiency, their calm professionalism, their terrifying, quiet refusal to adhere to the standard predatory model of galactic expansion, had not been a prelude to war, but the deliberate, multi-generational preparation for an invitation. The Cynosure had prepared for an invasion. They had received the keys to a new, shared future, presented by a species whose greatest strength was its capacity to dedicate its entire being not to what it could destroy, but to what it could create. The universe, cold and vast, had finally found an answer to its own great, agonizing question about the ultimate fate of intelligent life. The answer was not aggression, but logistics, not conquest, but the absolute, unstoppable, and uncompromising will to survive with ethical grace. The long, silent vigil of the star hulls had finally concluded. The real journey, the shared one, had just begun.